Welcome to episode 65 of the MMA Rundown podcast. And I was thinking about running this through on Friday night rather than actually like going through on the regular schedule and recording it early Sunday. And thankfully I didn't do that because over the course of the last couple of days, a lot of news has happened, specifically regarding COVID-19 that has affected Fight Island cards. Biggest news is that Gilbert Burns is now out of the main event of UFC 251, so I'll talk about that. Preview the whole UFC 251 card, and then from there, a few other COVID related topics. So the next one will be just sort of an idea after the Gilbert Burns news came out that I was thinking about, where in college football, nothing's official right now because if it were official, it would be a gigantic scandal, but it seems as though it's the case, especially with Clemson University, and I feel like a few other college football programs are doing it too, where it seems almost like they're trying to get some of their players sick right now just because if they get sick in late June, early July, and they develop the antibodies that when the season comes around, you're less likely to have a star player have to miss a game in a critical moment because they've already had and they've already developed antibodies. So it seems as though they're like, yeah, let's just take care of this now, get it out of the way, and then once we actually need to make sure we're healthy, we are. So I'll talk about that concept in MMA and whether or not that's a good idea for some fighters. Talk about some really unfortunate news out of Russia where Khabib's dad and a guy who, had he had more time, could have gone down as one of the greatest mixed martial arts coaches ever. Really, even without having extra time on this earth, still could potentially go down there or go down in that vein. But he passed away. Officially, they said it was due to COVID complications. I'll talk about that among other things surrounding his death. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Brennan Chubb, where it sounds as though he got COVID from a comedy show that he was working at. It seems as though he had symptoms for about 3 days, feels okay now, was riding his bike, and a lot of people are giving him crap about that. So I'll just recap that whole situation. And then talk about a few fights that were announced. Really isn't a whole lot to talk about right now in terms of new jiu-jitsu news or wrestling news. So it'll be a shorter one this time around. So main topic to talk about is obviously going to be the main event of UFC 251 that's between, or was between, Gilbert Burns and Kamaru Usman. And just before everyone flew out, they all were given tests before flying out to Abu Dhabi and then getting over to Yas Island. And a couple of Gilbert Burns' cornermen, but Gilbert Burns himself also tested positive for COVID-19. And as a result, they were pulled off of the card. Now, for what it's worth, though the situation itself is frustrating, it's not as though I'm like that mad at the UFC because they have rules that have been set in place by regulatory bodies and they just kind of have to follow it. With that being said, one of the things that is really frustrating to me is that over time, initially when this coronavirus came out, we didn't know a whole lot about it. So having an overabundance of caution, to an extent, it's kind of like, okay, well, until we get more information, let's be overly cautious, and then as we learn more about it, then we can kind of adjust that. As we have learned more about the coronavirus, we found that specifically for people who are under 25 years old, it's less dangerous than the flu. Once you get over that, it's just slightly more dangerous than the flu. With that being said, the precautions that are still being taken for someone Gilbert Burns' age, for example, are far harsher than precautions that would have been taken had it been the flu like last year, or even had he had a more dangerous disease, whether it's like ringworm or a staph infection. But because of the overabundance of caution early on and a lot of rules being set around that overabundance of caution, it seems as though now we're finding ourselves in situations where if a cornerman gets sick, we're still pulling fighters out of fights, or at least temporarily pulling them out. And if the fighter is sick a week ahead of his fight, rather than be like, okay, well, he'll probably be okay in a week, let's just kind of keep a close eye on this and maybe have someone ready just in case. They're saying, no, we got to pull these guys out right now. And it's tough because, again, if you put Gilbert on that flight, I don't know who else is going to be on the flight there. I think at this point, with the information we have there, it's one of those things where it's like you have to make a decision for yourself based off of your own health. Like, if I feel like whether it's my age, whether it's pre-existing conditions, if I feel like I'm at risk of something really bad happening if I get COVID, I need to be the one to say, I'm not going to go out in public and I'm not going to go out and take these risks. I'm not going to go fly across the world to corner one of my fighters, which is something that Ray Longo decided to do with Aljamain Sterling for that Sandhagen fight. I think it's on corners and people who are older, who are still involved closely with the sport and who would be in close contact with the fighters. I think it's on them to make those decisions to say whether or not they think it's safe for them to continue forward. But if they do feel that it is safe for them, then in a case like that, I kind of feel like Gilbert Burns, should he have chosen to, and again, I don't know what his specific case is. He said that he wasn't feeling well. That wasn't very specific. I don't know if he feels worse than he would if he had a cold, if he feels worse than he would if he had the flu. If part of that's just like an emotional thing where he's just not feeling emotionally well because he just lost a huge opportunity in his career. I'm not exactly sure what not feeling well meant from him in that tweet. That's what he's saying. But it does seem weird to me that with more and more information coming out about the virus, and more of that information speaking to it not being particularly dangerous for people who are in the kind of shape that these fighters are in, and in the age bracket that these fighters are in, it does seem frustrating to have fights like this get taken apart. And for Gilbert Burns, what's really tough about this is that it looks right now as though his title shot isn't just going to get pushed back a couple weeks and that Usman will be waiting for him. It looks as though Usman's probably going to be fighting someone else, which is likely to be Jorge Masvidal. So after that happens, you'd imagine that Usman's going to need some time to heal up before he's ready to fight again. At that point, does the UFC say, you know what, Gilbert, like you really earned that title fight. We're not going to make you fight again until we're ready to give you that title fight? Or do they say, you know what, Usman, who typically has issues with his legs, typically has knee issues, tends to get banged up in his fights, or are they going to say, you know what, we don't know when Usman will be back. We want you to fight again. Now all of a sudden, Gilbert Burns is going to be risking that title fight. Maybe in the meantime, another contender is going to get a big win, and all of a sudden they're going to find their way back into the title picture. Like it's not 100% clear whether or not Gilbert Burns is ever going to get this title fight back that he lost because he was sick a week out before the fight. And we've seen fighters have to fight through sicknesses at times. It seems as though for Burns, he probably would have been feeling fine. He probably will feel fine, I'd imagine, by Friday, by Saturday. And had he been allowed to fight, would probably feel okay to fight. So for him, he's going to lose this opportunity to fight for the title. And beyond that, it's so important for a fighter, if you can become a champion, what that does for you. Obviously, in the short term, you're going to get the champion's contract, so you're going to be making pay-per-view points. You're going to be making a higher base pay as well. But even once you lose that title, once you move on, if you're going to just teach seminars at martial arts schools, having the UFC title makes you worth more. If you're going to open up your own school, having that title makes you worth more. Even if you get into like a sales type of career, like being the UFC champion who's going to present at a sales meeting means more than being a guy who fought in the UFC presenting at a sales meeting. Like, having that title really does help you out a lot for the rest of your life. And a lot of times, looking at how the UFC works out, where a lot of champions only fight twice a year, if not less, getting a title fight in and of itself is difficult. Getting a title fight at the right time where you're fighting against an opponent who you think you can beat or who you can beat makes it even... I mean, that part's even more difficult as well. I mean, if you think about some of the great fighters in the UFC who've never won a belt, in a lot of cases, these are guys who have dominant wins over guys who were UFC champions but didn't have those fights while the guy was a champion. So, for example, Donald Cerrone is going to be one of those guys we look at as a guy who never could become a UFC champion, and though he was always a contender, he was never that guy. Donald Cerrone beat the shit out of Eddie Alvarez. If Donald Cerrone, for whatever reason, could have popped into a title fight while Eddie was champion, you know, maybe Donald Cerrone chokes in that moment, and maybe Alvarez gets his revenge, or maybe Cerrone beats Alvarez again like he did the first time, and maybe Donald Cerrone could have been a UFC champion at one point. I mean, RDA has had a lot of recent losses, including as some former lightweights. You sometimes have to wonder if those lightweights fought against him at the time he was champion. Could they have been champion at that time? Like, there are a lot of cases where you have guys who become a UFC champion both based off of timing in terms of they get a title fight at the right time, and then also based off of them facing the right opponent at the right time. And for Gilbert Burns, the timing was right for him to get that shot in the first place. The question in terms of whether or not Kamaru Usman was the right guy for him to beat, that's hard to say. The one thing I did hear, and I was really listening for more insight on this, and surprisingly it was from Kamaru that I got the best insight on it. I was listening for insight from anyone in that gym to kind of give an idea of who was getting the better of who. And Usman had made a comment saying that part of the reason why he was moving out to Colorado, especially for that camp, is that it was frustrating as a champion in a camp with other top-tier welterweights, because you got the feeling that any time that they got a round up on you, that they felt like they had gotten a round up on the champion, that solidified them. So at least to that end, it seemed as though he was implying that there were rounds that Gilbert Burns got on him. Now, whether that was Kamaru saying, I beat him like 90% of the time, but the 10% he gets me, he feels really good about it, I don't know. But at least in that, there was like some sort of indication that there are at least times, whether that's an MMA round, whether it's a jiu-jitsu round, it's hard to say, but there are at least times when Burns has gotten the leg up on Usman in the training room. So for Usman, and at least if you can remember those times, and maybe if you can replicate it, maybe things could have worked out where he could have been a UFC champion a week from now, but because he was sick a week ahead of the fight, and because we're still working off of rules that were based around a time when we had no information on the virus, especially broken out by age or broken out by health, He's not going to be able to get that fight. And now if Usman does take this fight, it seems as though Burns is probably not going to get that fight back for a while. Whether he has to sit around and wait and not fight for the next 6 months, or whether he's going to have to fight someone else, it's hard to say. But that seems like that's where we're at right now with that. So the main event for now is the Max Holloway versus Volkanovski fight. It sounds like there's a good chance that we're going to get Masvidal versus Usman. From what I'm reading right now, it sounds as though the contract side of Masvidal versus Usman is taken care of. The things that need to be taken care of now are more formalities where everyone has to get tested. They have to get flown out. They have to get tested when they're out there. Everyone's got to make weight. So that's not necessarily given that everyone's going to test negative and everything's going to go perfectly, but it sounds like the hard part is done at this point. So while there are some things in place that could ruin it, it does seem like Masvidal versus Usman is a fight that's going to happen. If that fight does happen, I'm interested to know how Jorge Masvidal has been training. I know he had been training with Bo Nickel. I believe Anthony Cassari is working with as well. I think he was also working pretty hard with Dustin Poirier for his fight. So it's not as though Masvidal has just been hanging out and not training this entire time. He has been training. The fact that he'd been training with guys like Bo Nickel and other really good wrestlers, you would have to figure would help him out a lot for this specific matchup. Not to say that Bo Nickel's style is going to match Kamaru Usman. I don't exactly know what Bo Nickel's wrestling style in an MMA context would look like because I don't know anything about his striking. So how he sets up his shots, it's kind of hard to tell. But they're just doing wrestling practice still. It doesn't hurt to work with guys like that and to learn some pointers from them as well. So Masvidal, though he's not going to be perfectly prepared as if he was in a camp and peaking right now for July 11th, it's not as though he's just being pulled off the street either, so that should be good news. For Usman, definitely a different matchup, going from Gilbert Burns, who's kind of like a hard-hitting jiu-jitsu guy, to go into a guy in Jorge Masvidal, who is a pretty good boxer, has decent kicks, decent knees as well. It is solid off the ground, but isn't anywhere near as deadly as Burns, which isn't a knock on Masvidal so much as it is that Gilbert Burns is a black belt world champion. So there aren't a whole lot of guys who can offer the threats that Gilbert Burns does on the ground. With that being said, you'd also have to figure that Gilbert Burns would try to take that fight to the ground. He actually has decent takedowns. We saw in the Tyron Woodley fight where Woodley was able to avoid getting taken down by Damian Maia and a lot of other really high-level guys, and Gilbert Burns was able to perfectly time a couple takedowns on him and take him down. So you'd have to figure that would be a threat for Usman as well. But I would be shocked if Jorge Masvidal took a shot on Kamaru Usman, let alone finish one. And so there are definitely some differences in this fight, differences in their frame as well. But for Usman, if he's able to take the fight right now, good on him. Good on him for not turning it down. He could have easily said, you know what, like, I've already been told the fight's off. I'm preparing for a few weeks from now or whenever this fight gets rescheduled. Thanks, but no thanks. But looks like the UFC is going to push forward with it. Looks like Kamaru Usman's okay with it. Looks like Jorge Masvidal is okay with it. So you got to give respect to everyone involved there. Not exactly sure what offer was given to Kamaru Usman. Or not Kamaru Usman. Well, I guess for Usman, you'd probably figure they threw him a little bit of extra money to thank him for being willing to put up with this. But for Jorge Masvidal, it sounds as though he was supposed to get the title fight ahead of Burns in the first place. The max offer they gave him was the same offer that he got for the Nate Diaz fight, and that wasn't enough for him. Did they come back with that same exact Nate Diaz offer, and this time he's like, oh, you know what, I realized I messed up last time, I'm going to take it this time? Did they offer him more than that? If they offered him more, how much more did they offer him? Did they offer him like $1 more just as a symbolic gesture? Or did they offer him like 50,000 more, 100,000 more, maybe even a lot more than that? It's hard to say, but either way, if this fight comes through, it's going to be a great main event. It's definitely something that I'm looking forward to seeing. In terms of how it goes, it's hard to predict that specific fight. Masvidal, I guess most guys who have trouble with Usman, they end up getting backed up against the fence, and at that point, you're kind of worried about Usman because he's got deceptively long punches, and he does have decent power. So it sounds like you can just kind of overlook those shots, but if you start to worry too much about the strikes, he's going to go underneath and take you down, and he's very good at that as well. So for Masvidal, if he can keep his back off the fence, he should be okay in this fight. For the most part, he does a pretty good job about keeping his back off the fence. I think strategically, with the guys he has in his corner, I'm sure they're probably telling him the same thing. It's not as though I'm observing something unique there that the coaches at ATT aren't observing. Like, I think for the most part, if you can keep your back off the fence against Kamaru Usman, you definitely improve your chances against him. You look at that Colby fight as well. Colby's back was rarely ever to the fence. That's why you didn't see a whole lot of wrestling, because Usman really couldn't corner Colby in the first place to set up those takedowns. But Covington was constantly moving forward as well, and that made it difficult for Usman to get his A game in place. So if Jorge Masvidal does the same thing, if he's able to stay in the center and trade with Usman and force Usman to shoot in space rather than shooting up against the fence, he can have a lot of success there, and I think there's good reason to believe that Masvidal can win the fight. But if Masvidal gets a little bit too patient, tries to fight from the outside and pick him apart, over time, Kamaru Usman's going to find his way in. He's going to find his way to get his takedowns, and I would imagine that over time, Usman's going to be able to just kind of put a pace on Masvidal and get a win, especially if this goes into later rounds. Even though Masvidal has been training, I don't think he's been training as hard as he'd probably like to in preparation for a 5-round fight. So if this fight goes into later rounds, that can definitely benefit Kamaru Usman. Coming event on the card is another title fight between Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski. There was a little fake report that came out this morning that Ben Askren pushed along that was saying that Max Holloway was pulling out of this fight because he had some weight cutting issues. That was from a fake Ariel Helwani account that's not actually real. Is it possible that something could happen between now and then that could ruin the fight? I'm sure, but as of now, that fight's still on, and I will treat it as such. There were a couple interviews that Max Holloway did, though, that gave a lot of people concern, where he was saying that he hadn't been training with his coach, really hadn't been training with his training partners either, that he was doing a lot of work through Zoom, which is just not an effective way at all to prepare for a fight. Even if his weight is on, if that's what his preparation was, if he wasn't actually, like, sparring with actual people, for one, that's surprising just because it's, like, I mean, I'm not in Hawaii, but, like, I'm not anywhere near the caliber of martial artist that Max Holloway is, nor do I have the clout that he does, nor do I have, like, the financial interest that either his training partners or his coaches would have in him. But about like a month into this whole thing, like, I was able to kind of get back to the gym on a somewhat full-time basis and be able to train constantly and get back into shape, get back into fight shape, I should say, in terms of like being able to keep up cardio through grappling and through striking. But then also on top of that, be able to get my timing back as well. And timing is a very important factor that you can overlook until you actually have to get back in there, and it's been a while for you. And training over Zoom is not going to do anything to help you with your timing. So if what he was saying is true and that he actually hasn't been training with actual sparring partners, that he's just been working on Zoom and that he's been like just talking to people, he is in a really bad spot heading into this fight. If that was sort of misconstrued, or if he was just kind of like letting people on with that, and we can just assume that we're going to get a regular Max Holloway in this fight, I think it'll be a pretty good fight. Like I had mentioned in the past, Holloway is one of those guys who over time makes his reads on his opponents and then sort of improves over the course of a fight. When he's getting a rematch, a lot of those reads are already built in, and that's going to help him out a lot. So assuming that we get a regular Max Holloway, I think there's a decent chance that he wins this fight, just because even if Volkanovski comes out hot again, I don't think it's going to take Max Holloway 3 full rounds to get his reads and start finding his openings where he can outland Volkanovski and start winning rounds. I think he'll be able to get to that point sooner, whether that's late in the first round, or maybe he loses the first round and then wins the next 4. Maybe it's at some point in the second round. But I think if we get a regular Max Holloway, I'd be tempted to pick him just because I think he's going to be able to make his reads a little bit quicker and start making his adjustments to Holloway. I think he's already got some adjustments in place for the leg kicks, and also has some adjustments in place for Volkanovski, throwing a lot of those winging punches every time Max would get in the pocket. I think Max is going to have some adjustments ready in place for that. But if he hasn't been preparing, and if he's been preparing the way that he said he has, and he has to like get his timing back out there in addition to trying to make his reads, I think he's going to be in for a really long night, and it's not going to go very well for him. So to me, I can't bet on this fight based off of what he said, because if what he said was true, even if he was a much better fighter than... I mean, let's just say this was Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega 2. If he said the same thing where he's like, yeah, I've been training, I've just been working on Zoom with people, I'd probably pick Brian Ortega in that case, let alone the guy in Volkanovski who actually beat him and looked really good in doing so. So to me, this is a fight where, from a betting standpoint, I want absolutely nothing to do with it because of that interview that Max Holloway had. I hope it isn't true. I don't see how it could be true. Unless he specifically was concerned about getting the virus, and he's the one who chose not to be around his coaches or be around his training partners, which I guess in that case, maybe instead of reading the headlines and reading what people are concluding, you should probably go into the data yourself and come to your own conclusions. But if that's the case, he's going to be in a tough spot. You would hope that if that's the case, that he wouldn't have taken this fight, or at least not taking it on this timeline. I guess title fights don't necessarily come all that often. So maybe for him, it's like, look, I'm being offered a title fight right now. If I say no, I don't know when I'm going to get another one. So at that point, maybe he's like, you know what, even though this isn't the best situation, it is a title fight. I am the challenger, so I have to say yes. But either way, I think coming into the first round of this fight, we're really going to get an idea of whether or not Max Holloway was telling the truth. And if Volkanovski runs right through him in that first round, there's a decent chance he was telling the truth. And it's kind of unfortunate to be taking this fight if that is true. Last title fight on the card is Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo. This fight is... It's just a really interesting fight in terms of how I think it's going to play out. The fact that Yan and Aldo have trained together before really makes it interesting, and that it sounds as though Jose Aldo got the better of Yan at that time. And if you have a memory in your mind of someone getting the better of you, even if you've gotten a lot better over time, and even if they've regressed, or I guess I probably shouldn't say regressed, that word bugs the shit out of me, but even if you've gotten worse over time, then it's like... In the first round, you could figure that even if Yan is the much better fighter at this point, that Aldo is still going to be in a good spot, just in terms of Yan being a little bit cautious and having to prove to himself that he's the better fighter, even if conceptually he knows it, just because of the fact that he trained with him before and it didn't go that well for him. So I think that makes it interesting. Aldo, it's not as though Aldo's a bad fighter. It's just I've noticed over time, and it's been noticed by a lot of people, that he's thrown a lot fewer leg kicks recently than he had back in the WC days and even in the early UFC days. And I'm sure a big reason to do with that is that every time you throw a kick, whether you're hitting a knee, whether you're hitting an elbow, whether it gets checked, a lot of times you can hurt yourself more throwing the kick than the person who you end up kicking. And you look at how hard he throws his kicks and how many kicks he's thrown over time. I'm sure he's gotten his foot just banged up numerous times. And so for him, it's one of those things where every time he's throwing the kick, it's not as though he's just throwing a weapon where he's like, yeah, this is going to hurt them and not me. I think a lot of times there's this concern of what's it going to do to me if I don't land it in the right spot, or if I don't set it up perfectly. And as a result, he just hasn't been that active with it. It's still one of those questions that's never really going to be answered, but a question I'd love to see answered in terms of if we would have had like the leg kicking Jose Aldo versus Max Holloway, who would have won those fights. There's a lot of talk, it seems, every time Max Holloway fights that he's this featherweight GOAT. And from a resume standpoint, his resume is way below Jose Aldo. But the reason why people would have him leapfrog Jose Aldo is because he beat Aldo twice and finished him both times. But the question to me is, if you had the leg kicking Jose Aldo, the younger version of Jose Aldo, if that's the guy who was fighting Max Holloway, would have those fights gone much differently? In that the Aldo versus Holloway fights that we actually got were mostly boxing matches where Holloway didn't have to concern himself too much with the leg kicks. Whereas if the leg kicks were involved, that would definitely cause a lot of damage to Holloway, but it also would slow him down a lot and sort of break up his game plan and break up how he likes to fight. And we saw the leg kicks be pretty effective in the Volkanovski fight, where Volkanovski used the leg kicks very effectively to beat Max Holloway, whereas Aldo, the version that fought Holloway, wasn't able to do so. And so, because it was mostly a boxing fight, and because Holloway had the advantage in the boxing, Holloway was able to get the wins, primarily through using his boxing. So, with that being said, at 135, Peter Yan, excellent boxer, probably a better boxer than Aldo. With that being said, Aldo's still a very good boxer. I was just rewatching the Aldo versus Moraes fight, and it was just crazy how fast Aldo's trunk movement is. Really quick head movement, really good at getting his hands up to block a shot. But it also seems as though a lot of times, even when he's pushing forward, he's trying to bait out the guy who's pushing back. He's trying to bait out a shot from them so he can slip out of the way and then counter with his own shots. And it kind of seems like Peter Yan does a lot of similar stuff as well, where Yan likes to bait shots out of his opponent and then counter their counter. Or I guess they're not necessarily counter, but it's more like you feint and then you feint to draw out a counter from them, even though you didn't throw the initial shot. You threw a feint that led to them throwing their initial shot, and then you try to counter off of that. That's something that we see. I saw a lot from Aldo, and that's something that Peter Yan likes to do as well. So there's a decent chance of this fight coming right out the gate. These guys, both in terms of them training together in the past, but also in terms of how they like to fight, that they're both going to be trying to throw a lot of feints and try to bait some shots out of each other so they can start countering. So it's possible that the early rounds aren't going to be all that entertaining. But over time, I'm sure things are going to open up more. They're going to start finding their openings, and we'll start seeing some more from them. So I would imagine first round, probably not super active. I think Peter Yan's going to be a little bit cautious regardless. But over time, they're going to start finding some shots, and over the course of the fight, we're going to learn more about who the better fighter is now. I think Peter Yan's going to be able to work his way through some of the mental hurdles that will be in place from having trained with Aldo in the past and probably not having it go terribly well for him. And then for Aldo, I think he's going to be in decent shape, especially if he's the one pushing forward. Like with the Moraes fight, there was a lot of talk about how great of shape Aldo was in for that fight. For the most part, Aldo was pushing forward. That's not a very tiring way to fight. So if Aldo can keep pushing forward, I think he'll be fine from a conditioning standpoint. But Peter Yan's eventually able to push him back and start picking him apart. In the later rounds, it's probably not going to look too great for Jose Aldo. So if I had to pick a winner in this fight, it's tough because I think that Yan should win this fight right now, assuming that they never trained together. I would definitely pick Peter Yan. The talk of Eduardo Dantas saying that Jose Aldo was getting the better of Peter Yan, I think that could definitely play a factor. It could play an early factor, but I think Peter Yan will be fine in the early rounds. I think he'll survive the early rounds, and I think later on he'll be able to take over and get the win here. So I see Peter Yan being the next bantamweight champion, which in a way could be good for Jose Aldo because from what we saw leading into that last fight, he just looked really bad throughout camp. I'm sure he's starving himself right now and probably isn't feeling all that healthy. So for him, the longer he stays at bantamweight, the more he's going to have to live that lifestyle where he's constantly in the gym, where he's just eating as little as he possibly can just to kind of stay within striking distance of 135. Whether that means he's just going to have to let some muscle just kind of go away over time or whatever he's going to have to do. It just doesn't seem like the best lifestyle for Jose Aldo. So while it would be nice to see him win another championship again, and yes, it'd be really cool if he did that, if he does lose to Peter Yan here and his road back to a title fight at 135 is one of those things where it looks like it's going to take him another year and a half if all goes perfectly for him. Maybe he decides at that point not to do it and moves back up to 145, or even better, it moves up to 155. And I think for Jose Aldo as a person, that's probably going to be best case scenario. So I'm kind of hoping that if he doesn't get the win here, that he quickly makes a decision to move up in weight. But you also kind of get the feeling with Jose Aldo where if he loses here and he decides to retire, that he's one of those guys where in a couple of years from now, after fighting his entire career at 145 and then finishing it at 135, he could be one of those guys who like walks around at 190, 200 pounds just because he's like happy he no longer has to watch his diet all the time and he just kind of lets himself go. Kind of hope for his sake he doesn't like become like an old fat guy in a couple of years, but with all the discipline he's had to have in his life to be within striking distance of 135 in the last year, if he wants to let himself go a little bit, I definitely can't blame him. Next fight on the card is Jessica Andrade versus Rose Namajunas. This is a title fight rematch. This one obviously will not be for a title. That first fight that they had, Rose Namajunas, I would still argue within that first round looked like the best female fighter I think I've ever seen. Her striking was on point. Grappling really didn't have to get involved too much. I think in the first round she did work her way out of a takedown where she got taken down, was able to roll through that time and not get caught on her head. But she just looked fantastic out there. But second round came around, and obviously we all remember that she was going for that Kimura to counter a slam and ended up landing right on her head, and that was that for the fight. But she was looking fantastic. She was the champion at the time, and then obviously everything fell apart for her on that one slam. So for this fight, let me see if we got the odds here. Yeah, she's the minus 185 favorite. So even though she got finished in the first fight, she's a pretty big favorite heading into this one, and I think the reason why is because she looks so good outside of that one moment. So assuming that she's been training and assuming that she's continued to improve, I mean, really, even if she hasn't continued to improve, I think she should be good enough to get the win here as long as she doesn't make any fatal mistakes again. But if she has been getting better, she can definitely put on a great performance here against Andrade. If she's able to get a finish, that's great for her. Even if she's able to win a dominant decision, it seems as though she's in a spot where the UFC would be perfectly fine putting her in a fight with Weili Zhang, assuming that they can get both of them freed up relatively soon. The fight before that is going to be Amanda Rebus versus Paige Van Zandt. I think it's pretty clear at this point that it'll be Paige Van Zandt's last fight in the UFC unless the UFC forks over a ton of money for her. The way that Paige has been talking about it, it sounds as though if the UFC and Bellator made identical offers, she'd probably go to Bellator. If the UFC made a slightly better offer than Bellator made, she might still go to Bellator just because of some of her past grievances with the UFC in terms of her feeling like she didn't get paid what she's worth. So this is likely going to be a send-off fight for her. For Amanda Rebus, really exciting prospect, very good jiu-jitsu, but she has a black belt in jiu-jitsu. I think she also has a black belt in judo. But on the ground, very solid, definitely better than Paige Van Zandt down there. On the feet, she's got some holes in her game, obviously, but she still hits pretty hard, still has some nice stinging shots that she'll land on the feet. So for Paige Van Zandt, it's tough with her because I just haven't seen much of her lately because she keeps getting injured. She keeps breaking her arm again. I don't know how that's going to affect her moving forward in terms of how she fights. The initial arm break came in the fight with Jessica Rose Clark, where she threw a spinning back fist and broke her forearm, and has had a bunch of breaks since then. Some of the best shots we've seen her land have been sort of unorthodox shots, whether it was like that Lyoto Machida like jumping front kick knockdown that she had on Beck Rawlings. The spinning back fists have been kind of cool for her too. But if she tries to make her game a little bit more basic here and just kind of like has like more of a traditional like boxing or Muay Thai style to her and doesn't really like throw in those unorthodox shots, I don't know that her game's going to be technical enough to the point where she's able to beat Amanda Rebus like that. If she throws in some of those more unorthodox shots where it can kind of catch her opponents off guard, there's definitely a chance for her to catch Rebus off guard and maybe land something big, whether it steals a round for her, whether she's able to parlay it into a finish. That kind of would be interesting to see. So from Paige VanZant, I don't know what to expect from her striking. I don't know how much improvement she's made over there all this time, if there's been any improvement at all. The grappling, her husband, Austin Vanderford, I'm sure has probably helped with that. But with that being said, I don't see her trying to take down Amanda Rebus. I don't know that she'd be successful at doing it. And even if she does, I don't think that's where she wants the fight to be. So for Paige VanZant, if she's going to win this fight, it's mostly going to be on the feet. And for her, it's just going to be interesting to see what sort of strikes she's comfortable throwing. And that even includes like the basic punches, like a 1 and a 2. Like a straight punch is something that she's comfortable with based off of how the plates are set in her arm. Do hooking punches concern her more? Like I don't know where her mind's at in terms of the striking, but there's going to be a lot to learn on that. But from a betting standpoint, Paige VanZant is a gigantic underdog here. She's a plus 625 underdog to Rebus being a minus 950 favorite. It's tough because I think under normal circumstances, like if we're looking at the Paige VanZant before all the arm injuries came about, do I think she should be this big of an underdog? Probably not. There are some girls who've been able to take her down and control her on the ground, but I don't know whether or not that's something that Rebus is going to be effective in doing. I think there's going to be some long exchanges on the feet here, and even if Rebus is a slightly better striker than VanZant, VanZant is still somewhat dangerous on the feet. She does have a couple knockouts to her name, so for her being a plus 625 underdog, that seems like it's a little bit much. But with her being out so long, with Rebus looking as good as she has recently, I would not feel comfortable betting on Paige VanZant, even if the odds are pretty high in the other direction. So I'd probably leave this one alone. But either way, it's probably going to be the send-off for Paige VanZant, so it's still going to be a fight worth watching. And it's a fight that could potentially push Rebus forward in her division and set her up for a really good ranked matchup coming up. On the prelims, we have Vulcan Ozdimir versus Yuri Prochazka. I believe Prochazka was a KSW champion. So he's a really hot prospect from outside the UFC who's going to be making his debut against Ozdimir, who's a former title challenger. So for Vulcan, you get the win here. You just kind of reaffirm, like, hey, look, I'm still towards the top of the ladder here. He's never had a fight with John Jones, even though I think we all know how that fight would go. He did have that fight with Dominic Reyes, where I think a lot of people thought that he won. If he gets a win here, depending on what happens at light heavyweight, I don't know what's next for Dominic Reyes. I don't know what's next for John Jones. Thiago Santos, we don't know what's next for him. Like, there are a lot of guys at the top of this division right now who are sort of waiting on John Jones. And if we get a dominant performance from Ozdimir here, maybe if Jones is still hanging around and Reyes is looking for someone to fight, maybe they make the Reyes versus Ozdimir fight again. And if Ozdimir puts on a similar performance and the judges are a little bit sharper, maybe Ozdimir finds himself in a title fight relatively soon. So this could be a really meaningful fight for him, depending on how it goes. For Prochazka, you get a win here against Vulcan Ozdimir. You're probably going to be ranked in the top 15 at least, if not top 10. And at that point, he could be fighting some top-ranked light heavyweights, and maybe over the course of a year and a half, he can find himself in that title picture too. So even though this is on a prelim card right now, I think the winner here really has a big chance to work his way up the division and work his way up really quickly, especially with the champion not being active. Next fight on the card is Muslim Salah versus Alessio Zaleski dos Santos. Alessio Zaleski dos Santos was, I believe, ranked as high as number 13 before losing to Li Jingliang. But really good Brazilian, known for his capoeira, known for a lot of his wild spinning kicks. Pretty good on the ground as well. Salikov, I believe, though he's Russian, I think he's one of the guys who is more of a striker than a grappler. I could be wrong about that. But either way, it should be a good fight at welterweight. We got Makwan Amir Connie versus Danny Henry before that. Leonardo Santos, feels like it's been a while since he's last fought. I think he was a former tough champion. Former member, I guess, if Nova União is still around, I think he's still with Nova União, but he was one of Jose Aldo's mentors, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt world champion, so very good on the ground. He'll be going up against a 10-0 Russian in Roman Bogotov. We got Marcin Tabora versus Alexander Romanov. Romanov's 11-0 Moldovan heavyweight, so interesting prospect that we have right there. We got Rolian Priva versus Zalgas Zamugulov. Don't know anything about him. Looks like he's from Kazakhstan. We got Carl Rosa versus Vanessa Mello. And then the first fight on the card is going to be Martin Day versus Davey Grant. So, first handful of fights, not exactly the biggest names, but still a good opportunity for them on a card that's going to get a lot of eyes. So, hopefully they can put on some good performances and really make a name for themselves. All right, next topic to talk about is going to be the Clemson COVID parties, is what I'll call them. It seems as though Clemson is definitely doing it right now just because of all the positive tests that are coming out of Clemson right now. That's not as though South Carolina is a hotbed for COVID right now, but it seems as though a lot of the Clemson football players seem to be getting cases of COVID-19. Could be an accident, could be on purpose. If it's on purpose, you'd imagine there'd be a lot of bad press around it, so I think I get the feeling that it's on purpose, but they're kind of playing it off like it isn't. But the idea there, like I had mentioned before in the preview, is that if everyone gets it now, and if you develop the antibodies now, there's a decent chance that come October, come November, when the big games come up, there are going to be some teams, especially teams that aren't doing these COVID parties, so to speak, or that aren't like trying to get everyone sick right now, where a star player is going to test positive over the course of the week. They're going to have to take them out of the game, and that's going to make a huge difference, and the team is potentially going to have their season ruined. So the idea now is if you can prevent that from happening in November by getting everyone sick right now and getting them to develop the antibodies right now, that would be the best move for you. As I mentioned, a lot of studies are finding that for people who are under the age of 24, and for these college football players, they're all under 24, that COVID is less dangerous than the flu. So for them, you have pretty much a minuscule risk of anyone getting killed or being severely ill. If they're all smart about it and they're not hanging out with like their parents or grandparents, then that should be okay as well. And so it seems as though it's actually a pretty smart move right now to get these young players, especially if they're on campus and away from everyone else. It seems as though it's a smart move to get them sick so they can develop the antibodies so that they'll be fine during the regular season. So then the idea I was thinking about is, well, how about MMA? Or is there any situation where some MMA fighters might say, hey, look, I've got a big fight coming up, or I should be scheduled for a big fight coming up. Maybe they have a fight scheduled in August. Maybe they got something that's coming up in September. Maybe they know they're going to have a fight coming up in September or later. Would it make sense for one of them to say, you know what, I'm going to go out of my way right now to make sure I come down with COVID, whether it's with my family life at home right now, or just in terms of who I interact with daily. I'm not going to be around people who are at high risk. So for me, it's not going to be dangerous if I get it. Yes, I might feel sick for a few days, but developing the antibodies is going to be worth it, and it's going to be able to prevent me from losing a huge opportunity like what happened to Gilbert Burns just now. And to me, it's tough because the idea of purposely getting yourself sick, whether it's something you know you're going to survive or not, whether you know it's going to be something that's going to be just kind of annoying like a weak cold, or whether it's going to be something that could be really rough like COVID-19, that idea just doesn't sound very fun. So the idea of doing it seems kind of tough, but I think after this fight is over with Usman versus Masvidal, assuming that happens, if we find that Gilbert Burns is going to lose out on that title fight, or he's not going to have another title fight for a while, or Usman's going to be out for a while and Gilbert Burns is going to have to take another fight, I think an argument could be made that had Gilbert Burns a few weeks ago decided, hey, I'm going to get this on purpose, get it out of the way now, and then just develop the antibodies, had he done that, it might have been worth whatever risk that he had taken to do so. Granted, if you're going to do that, you're going to keep yourself out of the gym. It's tough. I think on a fighter by fighter basis, you have to definitely look into that. If you are going to do it, definitely make sure that like you're negative for COVID-19 before you go back to the gym, because you don't want your training partners to get stuck with it either. But based off of what Gilbert Burns could potentially lose here, it seems as though we know what the risk of getting COVID at the wrong time can be for a fighter. It can be really highlighted depending on how much Gilbert Burns loses out on here. Is it worth potentially getting sick now so that your fight in 4 weeks from now or your fight in 8 weeks from now can be okay? I think for fighters who are looking at some major opportunities and some career-altering opportunities that are coming up, they may find that it actually is worth that risk, and especially if they're not around their parents that much, if they're not around grandparents that much. If everyone in their home is also relatively good about staying away from people who are in higher risk categories, it probably isn't going to be the worst idea for some of these guys to sort of take that same approach as what it appears that Clemson is taking right now, and saying, you know what, it's not going to be fun in the short term when I actually have to deal with the sickness, but if I can develop the antibodies, if I can see that I'm, based on my age, based off of my current health, if I can see that I'm not at a major risk here of getting deathly ill, maybe some fighters will feel it's worth it, and maybe they'll be able to avoid some situations like what we just saw this weekend. And though Gilbert Burns is out of his fight, it's not as though he's the only one who's going to be missing a fight because of COVID-19. There was a short period of time where Marina Rodriguez versus Carlos Esparza was taken off. It looks like that fight is back on. It looks as though Marina Rodriguez's corner was the one who had it. It wasn't her herself, so it seems like she'll still be on. But that fight was almost lost, and that would have been a really big opportunity for Marina. So it looks like Marina will still get it, and I think for her, if she's able to get the win over Carlos Esparza, that's going to push her up the rankings of her division pretty quickly as well. She's looked really good up to this point. Had a great win over Tisha Torres. Looked really good against everyone she's fought. And if she's able to keep Carlos Esparza from taking her down, is able to just beat her up and eventually get the win there on the feet, I could see her easily being in the top 10 after that. But even from there, may find herself within like a fight or two from the title, and that opportunity was almost taken away because her corner came down with COVID. So we're definitely seeing some fighters have great opportunities coming up that are being put at risk because of COVID-19. If you can find ways to work around it, it'd definitely be worth doing it. Is doing the COVID party idea sort of like a chickenpox party, but with COVID, is that the way to go about it? It's hard to say, but I think right now it's definitely something that should be considered, even if it sounds counterintuitive. So while I've been talking about a lot of younger fighters who have had COVID, and it seems as though in pretty much every major league there's been hockey players, there's been baseball players, there's been football players, there's been basketball players who have been testing positive for COVID, a lot of active athletes, and yet with all these type of positive tests, I can't think of a single active professional athlete who's died from it. There might be some that are like in some like third or fourth tier league of some other sport internationally that might have died, but I can't remember it happening if it has. So it seems like for a lot of these active athletes, the risk of death is not very high at all, and that kind of comes back to the point that a lot of people who have been dying of COVID have had other comorbidities, have been older, haven't been in good health, whereas these fighters are all these competitors at least are relatively young. They're all in relatively good health because you kind of have to be given what they do. And so for them, it's not that major of a risk, but for some of the older people, sometimes that's older corner people, it can be more of a risk. And in the case of Khabib's dad, Abdulmanap, it's still not clear to me what exactly happened with him. My understanding is that he went into a coma and had COVID-19. It's not clear that COVID-19 itself and COVID-19 alone is what put him in that coma, whether or not he had some other issues with him at the time as well. With that being said, his health issues happened, they started a couple months ago at least. So for him to just pass away now isn't exactly normal, given a normal COVID-19 timeline. Normally with COVID-19, it takes a couple weeks, and then assuming that COVID-19 is what's going to get you, and COVID-19 is the primary thing that gets you, you're probably not going to make it past a couple weeks, just because it's going to deteriorate your lungs, deteriorate your ability to breathe, and over the course of a couple weeks, you're going to get to the point where you can't breathe anymore. With Abdulmanap, that's not exactly the timeline on how things worked out for him. I think that was causing him issues in the first place, where they had to put him in a coma. But he was able to get out of that coma and sort of return to relatively normal. It sounds like he was able to get past COVID-19, but was still in medical distress and eventually passed away. So what they're saying, the connection with COVID-19 is that sort of the issues that were caused by COVID-19 never fully recovered, and they eventually led to his death. So they're saying that it was COVID-19 related. I have no medical background on this. I don't know exactly what happened with him. So to say that it wasn't a COVID death, I couldn't say that. But it definitely seems like there was more at play than just COVID-19, because the way that he passed away was much different than what you normally see in a typical COVID death. But with that being said, it definitely puts Abdulmanap as the biggest casualty of COVID-19 in the MMA world, definitely this year. And though there have been some other guys who've had it and who've gotten over it, and some of them who've had it worse than others. We remember Jacare Souza getting it, and then it seems like no one ever reported on it again because he was fine. Roger Gracie had it, ended up being really bad for him, but he was able to get over it. But for Abdulmanap, it was pretty bad. Eventually had to go to a coma, whether it was just COVID or whether it was some other stuff as well. But then never really fully returned to his regular self, and eventually passed away. So from a medical standpoint, it's very It's very unfortunate. But I think a bigger story about Abdulmanap is that in MMA, there are people who just have wrestling backgrounds who coach wrestling. There are people who just have striking backgrounds who will coach striking for fighters. People with just jiu-jitsu backgrounds who will talk about the submissions, guard passing, guard play, a lot of ground transitions. But it seems as though Abdulmanap was really unique in how he was able to kind of blend things together in a way that really made a lot of sense for MMA in terms of the wrestling, ground and pound that was designed to mix into a system perfectly with ground transitions, whether that's submissions or guard passing. It seems as though he was just really ahead of the game and really still is ahead of the game in terms of what he was teaching relative to what other schools are doing right now. I think that's a big reason why Khabib, despite not having the best striking, has been as dominant as he has been, because he's just so far ahead of other people on the ground in terms of his controls, in terms of how he controls legs, how he uses his ground and pounds to set up passes. I think in a lot of cases, especially with jiu-jitsu, like, you understand conceptually in jiu-jitsu positions where, like, you can control someone with just your legs and your arms are freed up where you can punch there. But with him, he actually had a system that was designed to know, like, here's exactly where you can throw your punches. Here are some specific spots where you can tie someone's legs up, even if it isn't necessarily to go for a guard pass. You can tie it up just to throw punches. Here are some spots where you can throw some punches to open up a guard pass. Like, a lot of what he taught really fed into MMA perfectly. And we're still at a time right now where ground and pound, though it is evolving, it's still got a long ways to go. But it seems as though what Abdulmanap was teaching versus what a lot of MMA schools would teach, where it's just kind of like, here's how you get a solid position, now throw punches. Whereas Abdulmanap was like, here's how you can find the best punches from each position. Here's how you can use them to pass guard, where everything just kind of fit into a really neat system. So it seems as though he was well ahead of his time, especially in MMA, for what he was teaching. It's kind of unfortunate that right now we're sort of in this revolution where there was a company that used to go by BJJ Super Deals, switched to BJJ Fanatics. They've recently put in a couple spin-offs. There's Dynamic Striking, and there's also Fanatic Wrestling. But they're selling a ton of DVDs and getting a bunch of really big people involved. Like, if you remember a couple weeks ago, there was that video of Anderson Silva asking Chael Sonnen a question, where it was sponsored by Dynamic Striking, where they were doing a video or an instructional video with Anderson Silva and getting him to kind of show off a lot of his techniques, and then they kind of did that offshoot thing with Chael Sonnen. But it seems like right now there's a lot of great fighters and great coaches who are now getting involved in the technique DVD game, where they're putting together a lot of DVDs. And I think Abdulmanap was one of those guys where, whether it's going to be Khabib or whether it's going to be Abdulmanap, a lot of people really want to see what he has to show. For the people who train with him in Russia, I'm sure they saw it day after day, and they were able to learn a lot. But I think a lot of people, myself included, were really hoping, whether it be Khabib or whether it be Khabib's dad, that we'd start getting some really good instructionals on how to mix in strikes with grappling in a more systematized way than what we've done in the past, where it's just kind of like, here's how you control position, now here's how you can throw some punches from there, rather than actually having a full system where you kind of tie the strikes in with the guard passing, with the submissions, and it all kind of flows together. And so losing him right now, it definitely seems like a lot of missed opportunities in the martial arts world, where there could have been a lot more knowledge that could have been spread globally through DVDs. Khabib could still be the guy to share that himself. I'm sure there are other students who have learned a lot that can share it as well, but I think a lot of people were hoping that Abdulmanap himself would be putting out a lot more stuff and really helping advance the game a lot further along. But it seems as though at this point, Khabib's assuming that he still wants to fight. I'm not sure where his motivation lies right now. I know there was a time when he was getting injured a lot where he was thinking about retiring, and his dad pushed him to continue back on. Now with his dad out of the picture, and Khabib making a ton of money, does Khabib feel as though, and this is someone who's talked about retiring before, does he feel as though he wants to keep going for a while past this? Does he want to maybe take one more fight with Gaethje, retire, and then just kind of move on and put fighting in his rearview mirror? It's hard to say, but it seems as though, in addition to Khabib losing his father, in addition to what a lot of people say is a great man losing his life, it sounds as though this could be an event that could sort of push martial arts back a few more years than it otherwise had to, because it feels like whenever he was ready to sort of share his knowledge with a broader audience, that the MMA game would definitely make some big evolutions as a result of it. So it's a big loss to lose Abdulmanap. It's unfortunate in any case, whether he was just a father who had nothing to do with MMA, but was just a fighter's father who passed away, or whether it's a guy like Abdulmanap who had a great background in the sport, who was a great coach in the sport, and who had a lot of great technical knowledge to share. It's a tragedy either way, but I think in addition to Khabib losing his father, I think the martial arts world lost a great thinker and lost a guy who who has a lot to teach a lot of people. Next topic to talk about is Brennan Chubb. So he apparently was doing a stand-up show in Texas. Got COVID from that show. Had mentioned that he was sick for a few days after, and then was just doing like a bike ride later. And a lot of people were really pissed about him online, or pissed about that online, saying, "Oh my goodness, like just 3 days ago you had COVID and now you're outside. Like this is the wrong way to go about it." As far as COVID goes, or at least for him, if he's feeling fine enough to do a 20-mile bike ride 3 days after getting it, I guess that kind of shows that, at least for him, for someone in his age group, I guess you could say he's in decent health. I don't know what his specific health situation is. For him, if it was so insignificant that after 3 days he's ready to go back and ride a 20-mile bike ride, then I guess good. It shows it's not really affecting relatively younger and healthy people, which is sort of what we've seen to this point. So I guess that's a good sign for him. It's kind of funny that it seems like every time you have someone who's like talking about how the response to COVID has been overblown and then they end up getting COVID, that like the headline of "they got COVID" is like some kind of dunk on them to like show that they were wrong, when in reality most of the people who, whether it's like the people who go out and protest lockdowns and then get COVID, or whether it's someone like Brennan Schaub who's talked crap about COVID for a while and gets it, it seems like a lot of people think that the story ends right when they get COVID, when in reality just about all these people end up surviving it. So then it's kind of like, well, that sort of proves into their point. So for Brennan Schaub, if he was saying, yeah, COVID's overblown, we should be locking everything down, it's not that dangerous, he gets it, and then 3 days later he's ready to do a 20-mile bike ride. That kind of goes into his favorite, sort of kind of goes along with what he's saying. And I'm not like a big Brennan Schaub defender. I don't really listen to much of his stuff. I find him to be kind of annoying. Definitely feels like one of those guys who says stuff he doesn't necessarily mean, just to kind of like have the hot take just to get people talking and just to kind of build his name off of it. It's sort of like what you see with ESPN and a lot of their morning shows. It seems as though that's kind of what Brennan Schaub was bringing into the MMA world. So it's not as though I ever really listen to him all that closely and think, oh, well, if Brennan Schaub said something, therefore it's true. But in terms of like dunking on him as being like, haha, you got COVID after all you said, looks like if he's riding his bike 3 days later, he's not going to change his mind on what he was saying before, and if anything, it's going to kind of solidify what he was saying. But as far as him actually taking that bike ride and being outside, the whole 6 feet thing, the idea is that for you to spread COVID, usually you're going to be within 6 feet of someone else. But it's 6 feet. The idea of the 6 feet number is that you're going to have like droplets come out. Usually if you're talking or whether you're coughing or doing anything else that can like expel droplets from your mouth. But what that means is that it's like from your mouth and generally like straight forward from there. So the 6 feet thing is kind of like if I'm facing you, it's like 6 feet from where I'm facing. So if you're right behind me and I'm coughing, you're probably going to be fine as long as it's not hanging in the air and then you kind of like fill into that spot. If you're to the side of me, you should be fine. In either direction, it's just if I'm facing you, that's where it could be an issue. But even still, like if you're facing someone and it's just for like a very brief period of time, the risk isn't relatively high unless I like spit at you or something like that, or unless we're like kissing. But if it's for a brief period of time, it's not as though the risk is very high, at least based off what I've seen so far, based off the information that I have. So for him riding the bike, he's not going to be face-to-face with people very much at all if you're riding a bike out on a trail or out in the mountains. And if you are face-to-face with someone, whether if they're coming in the opposite direction, for one, you're probably not going to be facing directly at them, and they'll be facing directly at you. It's probably going to be off to the side a little bit, so it'll be more at an angle rather than straight on. And even still, it's going to be very brief. So, is it likely that someone else is going to catch COVID-19 by riding on the same bike trail as Brennan Schaub? From what I know about how it transmits, probably not. So I don't think he's really putting too many people in risk, but there are a lot of people who are still really uptight about it. I think with COVID-19, a lot of people read the initial news on it when there really wasn't a whole lot of information about it. Heard that it was bad, and they kind of were like, okay, well, that's what I know about it. I don't need to constantly learn more. And so I think a lot of people, their conceptions on the dangers of COVID-19 are based off of what they read back when everything was getting shut down in early March. And so just the idea of him being outside, like, oh my goodness, like he's going to be closer than 6 feet to people, he's going to be outside, he can spread it. But based off of the knowledge that just keeps, or based off of the information that keeps coming in, I don't think that Brennan Schaub's really putting a whole lot of people at danger by riding a bike out in the mountains. I don't think there are going to be too many situations where he's going to be very likely to spread it. I'd imagine he still has it if it's only been 3 days. Even if the symptoms are gone, I think he's still carrying it at this point. But to me, the odds of him spreading it aren't all that high, so I'm really not that outraged with what he's doing right now, and I don't think that he really got owned by the fact that he got it in the first place. Last topic to talk about is a few fights that were announced. So Andrea KGB Lee will be fighting Roxanne Modafferi. So both girls are sort of like right on the edge of the top 10 in their division at 125. So winner probably keeps around the same spot they're at right now. Loser, I don't know if they're going to that they're going to get pushed back too far, but at the same point, it's going to push them a little bit further away from the title picture. Andrea, both of them recently lost to Lauren Murphy as well. Looked as though Lee probably should have won her fight with Murphy, whereas Modafferi definitely lost that one. But Lee also had that loss to Calderwood as well, that it seemed as though had she gotten the win there, that she would have found herself in the title picture relatively soon, but unfortunately gets the loss to Calderwood, gets that tough loss to Lauren Murphy, and now she's in a spot where she has to fight Modafferi and risk losing another one in close succession. For Modafferi, had that one over Macy Barber that got a lot of people really high on her. I think part of the reason why is because people were overly high on Macy Barber, so the fact that Modafferi beat Barber made people think that Modafferi was further along than she really is. But that fight with Murphy didn't go terribly well for her. I think on the feet, Andrea Lee should have a big advantage over Modafferi. If Modafferi's able to get to the ground, Lee's a very good grappler. Not as though she's like a great grappler, like the best in the division, but she's very competent down there. So I don't know that I see Modafferi being terribly effective down there. So I think for the most part, this fight will stay on the feet. Andrea Lee will pick apart Roxanne Modafferi and she'll be able to get the win. We've got a pretty good fight at lightweight between Beneil Dariush and Scott Holtzman. So Holtzman's always a dangerous guy, pretty good wrestling. Just tank of a man for 155 pounds. And then Dariush is a guy who's hung around the top 15 for a while. Excellent jiu-jitsu. Has some openings on the feet, but is also incredibly aggressive on the feet as well, and has had some great knockouts as a result. A lot of people will remember the knockout of Drakkar Klose, where that was sort of a back-and-forth fight where Dariush looked like he was potentially going to get knocked out, and then comes back, runs Drakkar Klose across the cage, and then ends up knocking him out against the fence on the other side. So we'll see if we get another barn burner like that on the feet, or if this fight ends up being a little bit more technical and they try to pick each other apart. But either way, that should be pretty fun. And then the last fight to mention is a rebooking of a fight that was supposed to happen earlier on this year between Ricardo Llamas and Ryan Hall. This fight is being rescheduled for August 29th, and it's a fight I'm definitely excited to see because Ryan Hall, he's looked good so far. Granted, it's kind of weird with Ryan Hall, and I guess this is something that I mentioned a lot in the past too, is that it seems like there are certain styles of fighters where they'll look really good against unranked guys, and eventually they'll get into the top 15 and they'll start struggling, and then it's kind of like all the hype disappears. And like one of the styles that you see a lot where that's the case is the striker who knocks everyone out but isn't like particularly like technically skilled. Like they have decent technique, but there's not as like very high level strikers that just hit really hard and they're able to work their way towards the top of the division because of it. So that's kind of like your Doo Ho Choi type of person. Song Yudong, Sean O'Malley is a hot one right now that sort of fits that mold as well. But you also have the jiu-jitsu guy who is able to take guys down and, or at least get the fight to the ground and get a quick finish. And it seems like those types of guys also can have good little runs up until they face the top of their division. And Ryan Hall is definitely fitting into that right now at his weight, where it seems like most guys he's able to find ways in on their legs and cause problems. And if he's not able to get to the ground, he kind of has that weird style on the feet that gives people problems where he just throws a bunch of kicks. And they're worried about getting a little bit too close to him at times. So he's able to win fights that way as well. And so Brian Hall is one of those guys where some people are thinking that he could potentially be a title challenger sometime soon. And this Llamas fight is really going to be one of the first real challenges for him, where he's going to face off against a guy who's been a perennial top ranked fighter in his division. And if Ryan Hall can get a dominant win here, then that's definitely going to solidify his spot as a guy who can contend. If he doesn't, then maybe this is the fight where he gets exposed. But either way, it's one that I'm definitely looking forward to. Llamas is going to be the toughest fight that he's faced right now. I don't know that I see Ryan Hall knocking him out with one of his wheel kicks. Is he able to get an entry on Ricardo Llamas and catch him with a really quick heel hook? I guess that's a possibility, but you would figure that, technically speaking, Ricardo Llamas should have a pretty big edge here, but Ryan Hall is dangerous in where he's good. He's not good everywhere, but in the areas that he is good, he can definitely cause problems for most guys, and it'll be interesting to see if he's able to get Llamas into those spots, particularly if he's able to get him, whether it's an inside triangle or a 50-50 type of position. I know Ryan Hall likes 50-50 a little bit more, but if he's able to get that kind of position and then be able to find a finish. It is kind of crazy that Ryan Hall did have a loss in the Ultimate Fighter, but ended up getting back into the finals just because another fighter had to pull out. I think he lost to Saul Rogers, who I think is down Bellator if he's even still out there. He might be in Cage Wars at this point. But either way, it seems like a lot of people forgot about that and just view Ryan Hall as this undefeated guy who's unstoppable. He hasn't beaten before, but he's looked decent recently. Assuming that he's continued to be training, you figure he's gotten a lot better over time as well. And this Ricardo Llamas fight is going to say a lot about him. But it's nice that he's got someone with a relatively big name that signed up to fight him. And assuming that everything goes well, it'll be nice to finally see him fight again, because it seems like it's been forever since that BJ Penn fight. So that covers it for this week. Obviously, next week I'll be back talking about UFC 251. Hopefully, every fight that I just previewed is going to happen, including the Masvidal versus Usman fight. There's also going to be a fight card. I believe it'll be on Thursday, but on July 15th. So I'll be previewing that. There's also going to be a July 18th card, so I'll preview that one as well. So it'll be a double preview. I'm not sure yet if next week, if I'll have 2 episodes in a week, kind of like I did last time the UFC had 2 events over the course of a week, or whether I'll just handle both of them on one. But either way, next week I'll be previewing those 2 events in addition to recapping UFC 251, and I would imagine there's going to be some other big news that comes up over the course of the week. Hopefully it's not like this week where it seems like every big piece of news had to relate to COVID-19, but whatever does come up, I'm sure I'll be covering it as well.